Okay, hi, good day, everybody. I think we'll start our session now, considering it's 4 p.m. So, welcome to Enago's exclusive session demonstrating live editing of a sample manuscript. My name is Faisal Siddiqui, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's session. As an editor myself for the past 10 years, I have come across several manuscripts with critical quality issues, which require major edits to become suitable for submission. Understanding the pain points of authors, we designed this session to help them understand the oversights caught by editors during the screening process and how Enago's top academic editors can help them enhance the quality by improving the language, readability, and logical structure of their research manuscripts. So I'd just like to take you all through just an FAQ. So in the chat option available at the below control panel, please feel free to send us your questions using the question tab, right? Or you can use the chat box as well. We will address these questions towards the end of the session. Now, before we begin, I would like to introduce you all to our expert editor, Jenny Roy. Now, Jenny is a board certified medical lab scientist. She holds a master's degree in molecular biology and epidemiology, and she has published in the Archives of Virology and the Journal of General Virology. Jenny has written several blogs and is an experienced textbook editor. She joined Enago in May of 2017 and has edited more than 1,300 manuscripts till date, with an overall client satisfaction index of 4.75 out of 5, which falls under Enago's top 5% of editors. In 2020, she became a VIP editor for biomedical sciences in recognition of her consistent top quality editing. Now, a little about myself. I'm an experienced editor and have worked in the writing and editing industry for more than 10 years. At Enago, I handle editing and quality management of various projects involving reputable and global journals and publishers. Through my editing experience, I have developed a thorough understanding of how to edit text written by English as a second language or ESL authors, and I am passionate about helping such authors publish their manuscripts for a wide audience. So I'm very excited to host this session, and I thank all of you for joining us today. Coming to the agenda of today's session, Jenny will demonstrate manuscript editing, and while she does that, she will simultaneously discuss how a journal editor evaluates a manuscript and decides how much work is needed or whether the quality of the manuscript is too poor and it should be rejected directly. We will discuss advanced grammatical errors and complex language usage, including logic flow, transition, clarity, and readability. You will learn how to keep an eye out for the mistakes commonly made by both native and non-native English speakers. We will also touch upon the scientific academic requirements, such as formatting, authorship attribution, and the appropriate presentation of tables and figures, and some subject area specific terminology and usage. So without further ado, let me hand over the mic to Jenny, and let's get started with the session. Over to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Faisal. Hi, everybody. Today I'm here very excited to explain to you what we as Enago editors do behind the scenes to make your documents publishable and to increase the chances of a journal accepting it. It's very important to understand that we don't just do an automated check. We don't run it through Grammarly and then give it back to you. Every single editor that works for Enago is a native English speaker, like I am. I have a subject matter expertise. I am an expertise in biosciences. I have a degree in biomedical technology. I've published papers. I've also completed a copy editing course, which is also very important because as an editor, I'm looking at your paper for English errors as well as scientific errors. So it doesn't help to have somebody who doesn't have that field of expertise in science to look at your paper. And at the same time, it doesn't help if the editor is not a native English speaker person, because only native English speakers will be able to check things like idiomatic expressions, colloquialisms, and whether you're using the correct terminology. So just to start off with, I'm going to give you a few examples of immediate rejection that would happen if you submitted such things to a journal. If you look at my first example, it would be a rejection due to an ethical issue. If you look at the title, Experimental Vaccination of Prisoners in Uganda Against Ebola Virus. So straight away, if the journal editor saw that, they would be querying, why are you using prisoners? There's a whole ethical conundrum around that, a whole dispute. So I think it would be an immediate rejection. You'd have to have to try and get that through an ethics committee. I think you'd really, really battle to do. So it's very important to remember that whatever you do, it has received ethical approval before you go ahead. Another example is this one here, where the title of the paper is simply Coronavirus Vaccination. That will also be rejected because it's not saying which coronavirus, although we're familiar at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. There's many different coronaviruses, so that's not clear at all. It's not telling you which vaccination, maybe the make of it, or is it which strain is it against? And it's not telling you what you're investigating at all. What about the vaccination are you investigating? So that's another example of an immediate rejection. The other thing that's really important to consider when you're submitting a manuscript is that you submit it to an appropriate journal with the appropriate scope. You may have written a most amazing paper, but if you're submitting to the wrong journal, they'll reject it. So here's a case where the author got a bit confused with where they should be sending their paper. They're talking about mango malformation disease and the associated fusarium species. So mango malformation disease is a disease that occurs in mangoes, in fruit. It's not a human disease. And mangoes are grown in a tropical area. So they decided to submit it to Frontiers in Tropical Diseases. And that's really not the right type of paper at all, type of journal at all, because Frontiers in Tropical Diseases deals with tropical diseases that happen in people. It's got nothing to do with mangoes or to do with agriculture. So that would definitely be rejected. And the last one, that's a very glaring mistake. You must never disclose identifiable patient information. I'm sure you all know about, if you're showing a person, a photo of a person, you must black out their eyes and any identifiable parts. So here in this case, it's a table about HIV status and comorbidities of patients residing in Belfast, Northern Ireland. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. If you look at the table, we've given some patient numbers, nothing wrong with that. But here's where the problem is. The writers of this paper have given the actual names of the patients. Even worse, they've got here, Sarah Miller is the spouse of the patient above it. They've got the age of the patient. So anybody living in Belfast, Belfast, Ireland could look at this and work out who the people are. It's totally not on, and you could leave the age, but this whole column of the patient's name must definitely be out. Okay, now just moving on to some easier little tips for you about manuscript evaluation. Fatal mistakes that will also result in immediate rejection. Sorry. The first one is the title. As you've seen in those previous examples, if the title is missing, it is misleading, or it is unclear, that will lead to immediate rejection. Again, with the abstract, you've got to state your study objective in the abstract. If it's not there, or it's unclear, a journal editor will stop reading because they won't understand what you are talking about. Another important part of the abstract is to ensure that your results and your conclusion do not differ from your manuscript body, your figures, or your tables. So if you're investigating, say, the prevalence of a disease, and you write in your abstract, the prevalence is 50%, and then in your results section of your text, you've written the prevalence is 20%, there's a huge error there. So always check at the end when you've written that what your information in the abstract is the same as what is in the text. In the introduction, you must always remember to put your study question or your research problem. If that's not there, your paper will be rejected. And remember to put your objective. Usually the objective comes quite near the end of your introduction, because you've explained the background of your problem in the beginning. And at the end, you're going to say, in this study, our objective was to ... In the method section, something that journal editors will look at is if you have done incorrect or inappropriate analysis. If you've used an old method when there's a new method, or if you've just totally decided to make up your own method that is just not on and hasn't been proven. Also, insufficient analysis. Sometimes you might come to a conclusion, but it's not statistically supported. You've used the wrong tests. Another thing that could be wrong with your analysis is that you haven't got any control variables, or the ones that you've used are totally incorrect or inappropriate. And that would lead to having the incorrect results. In the discussion section, you must remember to keep it logical and relevant. Remember that in the discussion section, you're not going to be repeating your results. You're going to be interpreting the results. What are the consequences of what we found? Also in the discussion, you must remember not to be biased. If there is a competing research group who has found something else different to you, don't omit it. Remember, the people that are reviewing your manuscript are also going to be experts in the field, and they'll pick it up if you've omitted something that's maybe in contradiction to your finding. Rather, what you would say is, Smith found out that this was not the case, and you could say something like, although our study found the opposite, this is something we are going to be looking into in future studies. And then at the end, after your discussion, you will either have a conclusion paragraph or a conclusion section, which will just summarize the findings, not repeat everything again, just a few sentences of your key findings, and also mention the contribution of what you have found out to the study field or its potential application. So overall, it's important to remember that even if your manuscript has the correct structure and the correct components, if the writing is not clear and not correct, the paper will be rejected. And that's why editors are crucial to a successful submission. Now I'm going to be showing you an actual paper that has been edited by me, and show you some tips and tricks of how to write in a good manner. So going off of what I was talking about with the different sections, here you can see in the abstract, highlighted in green, they presented the research problem. And here in yellow, the study objective. These need to then be restated throughout the paper. So in the introduction, there's the research problem. It's been restated. And another sentence here about the research problem being restated so that the reader understands exactly what you are doing. And then, as I mentioned, at the end of the introduction, then you need to restate your study objective so that the readers know what is coming up. It's like a preview of what you're going to be doing. In the discussion section, again, restate your study objective so that you're flowing from one area to another. Then it's also important to put, if you've got any limitations or any highlights or things that you want to do next time to your study, you can put this over here. As these authors have said, our paper has many limitations in our approach and data analysis. Remember, there's nothing wrong with saying that you have limitations or you have a weakness in your study. Bring it to everybody's attention and then say what you are going to do going forward to address this. And then here is the last paragraph of the discussion, which is your conclusion. And here, as I said before, it's a very good idea to state the application or how this can be used further in the field of study. And in this case, they have said, we urge the development of a more systematic procedure for the collection of parental phenotype data. So they've said what we can do with the data. And then just a comment I wanted to make on the title here. I looked at the title when I started this. It's been something very important to do. And then I read through the paper. Once I got to the end, I realized that this paper is actually dealing with relationships between phenotypes and genotypes, between parents and their children. And another word for children would be offspring. Here they've said it's to do with parents and siblings. A sibling is a brother and sister. So that is totally wrong. It's totally misleading. So that is a major change that needs to be made. Also, on top of that, because they've used the word sibling, I would then go and have a look through the whole paper, doing a search for the word sibling. And if that was mentioned anywhere, I would change it to offspring, just to be 100% sure that there's consistency throughout the manuscripts. Another little thing that was picked up when I read through the whole manuscript was that here in blue, they've said our findings indicate that the imputation scheme needs approximately 1,000 non-focal phenotypes. So that's a result. What I did then was check through the paper, and at all other instances in the paper, it refers to 100 non-focal phenotypes. That's a huge discrepancy. Either if I am confident that they did mean 100, I would change the 1,000 to 100. Or if I'm not too sure which one they meant, perhaps during something like this, in cases they've got 100, but then in the discussion they say 1,000 again, and in a table they say 100, but in the figure they say 1,000, then I'll just write a little note here for the authors to say, please have a look at this. There's a discrepancy. Which one is correct? And that covers that little section about the immediate rejection.
Thank you, Jenny. Now let's just take a quick short break and use this time to answer a question that will be displayed on your screen. We encourage all the attendees to participate in this poll. So I'll just read out the question. Which of the following points are fatal mistakes that could result in immediate rejection by a journal? You can feel free to choose more than one option. Your options are an unclear study objective, incorrect formatting of text, minor grammatical errors in the file, bias in the discussion section, and violation of research ethics. We'll take about 10 more seconds to get this answer. We encourage that everybody please provide your answers. All right. Yes, you can feel free to click more than one option. You can click on it's a multiple choice option, the format, so you can choose more than one answer. All right. So I think I'll ask Jenny to continue with the next topic.
Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you.
Okay, the next topic that I'm going to be talking about is how us as editors make little changes that can improve the quality of your paper. And as I said before, we make changes to English and scientific content. The most important out of all of the things that I really think needs emphasizing is that you need to be concise. Don't use a lot of words if only one will do. English is a very direct language. People get bored if you don't get to the point, and they'll probably stop reading what you're writing. So here's an example. It comes from the paper that I've been showing you previously. If you have a look, this paragraph here is 95 words. If you can just have a read of it, I'll also read it out. They've said, for instance, looking at late onset Alzheimer's disease in the UK Biobank, there are approximately 20% of UK Biobank participants older than 65 at the age of recruitment. And then they've given a reference. And only a few hundred late onset Alzheimer's disease cases. The reason of short cases is twofold. First, there are only about 100,000 elder people to start with without specifically targeting Alzheimer's disease research. Second, the recruitment could be biased towards healthier participants, which may give rise to an even lower prevalence of Alzheimer's disease compared with the general population. And they've put another reference over here. So that's quite a wordy sentence, paragraph. It's got a lot of information in it, but it is a bit confusing when you read it to work out what is the author is trying to say. So what I would do in this case is I would have a look at that paragraph and just pull out the main points. So the main points from that text is approximately 20% of participants in the UK Biobank are aged 65 or older. Another point that comes from this is only a few hundred have late onset Alzheimer's disease. The third point, there are approximately 100,000 older adults in the UK Biobank. And then the last point that they made is that the study population may not be representative of the general population. And there's two reasons for this. The sample size is small and recruitment may be biased towards healthy participants. So having listed the key points, we can now combine everything to make the edited text. And it would be like this. For instance, approximately 20% of UK Biobank participants are aged more than 65 years. Just having a look at that, you can see how I've taken the 20% from here and the 100,000 and joined them together. So you can see in context, when you're, as the reader, what is 20%? How many people does that really mean? And it's all here together in one section. Then we've gone on to say that the participants are aged greater than equal to 65 years. Using a sign like that just reduces your word count, makes it easier to understand. So we've said approximately 20% of UK Biobank participants are aged more than 65 years at the time of recruitment. Then I have put the reference, which whenever you do a reference like this, it would be the author's name and then the year in brackets. Then I've said, thus, there are only a few hundred cases of late onset Alzheimer's disease. This small sample size, together with a possible bias towards the recruitment of healthy participants who may have a lower predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, could result in a lower prevalence, which may not be representative of the general population. And then I've put the reference here. So doing that, I've now reduced your paragraph from 92 to 75 words, and that's about a 20% reduction. So you can see the importance of an editor doing making your work concise, especially when you submit to journals who have stringent word count requirements. And this is something that we can offer to you, is to reduce your word count. Here's just a few more tips and examples. And then I will show you in the actual manuscript where I've made these changes. The first thing is that you never put a period at the end of a title, because a title is not a complete sentence, it's a phrase. The second thing that's important to remember is that terms must be politically correct. That's sometimes quite hard to do if English is not your first language. So that's something that us as editors will look at. The third thing is that abbreviations and acronyms must be defined in full at first use in the abstract and in the main text, not just in the abstract. Spelling must always be consistent. That's something that us as editors do look at, and I'll show you an example. And remember, if you're using US spelling, prefixes are typically not hyphenated. UK spelling, they prefer a hyphenation. So an example would be, in UK spelling, it would be anti-diabetic with a hyphen. US spelling, it would be written as one word. And the other thing to remember is that a journal article is a formal document. It's not a conversation or a magazine article, and you would need to use formal language. So here's some examples. You can see here in the abstract, here in yellow, that the authors have referred to the participants as elder people. That can be a bit offensive, and a better term to use in English would be to say older adults. So what I would do in this case is I'd also do a find and replace search throughout the document for elder people and replace it everywhere throughout the document as older adults. Then going on to abbreviations, here you can see that this is the first mention in the abstract of Genome-Wide Association Study, or GWAS. They've written it out in full, they've defined it. And then here in the blue again, you can see they've used the abbreviation, and here they've used the abbreviation. However, if you go down into the introduction, you can see that they just use the abbreviation by itself without defining it. So I have added that in. This is quite a common error, not just with people who's where English is not the second language, is not the first language. It's an error throughout. Lots of people forget about redefining. Then here in the green, you can see an example of using a dash and not using a dash. So in the abstract, they've done non-focal here as one word and here as two words. So if I knew that they were writing in US English, I would change all instances with the dash to no dash. If I wasn't too sure, I would say, please be consistent throughout the manuscript and use either one word or with a dash. Another thing I was talking about is using formal language. Here they have started a sentence with and. That's okay if you are talking in a conversation to someone. But here we are using formal language in a scientific document. So instead of saying and, I've changed it to additionally. Another case of informal words, they've said that the imputation scheme needs about 100 phenotypes. Instead of about, a much better, more scientific, formal word would be approximately. That's quite a common error that I find when I'm editing, and I would change that throughout the document. Here's a few more tips and examples for you. Use conventional terminology. Don't use something that you think sounds better than the term that is always used by other people. I'll show you an example just now. Be concise, which I've covered with my example already. Check your language register. Get straight to the point. Don't try and be over formal either. Don't use legalese or technical terms just for the sake of using it. You don't want to overcomplicate the matter and lose the meaning of what you are trying to say. But then on the other hand, don't go too informal and use contractions like didn't, won't, should have. That's also a no-no in academic writing. And then, as I mentioned from the above examples, don't use words like and, but, because, or also when you are doing academic writing. It's only fine when you're doing something informal. Words, when you use them, must be appropriate and they must be correct. It's very important to choose the right word to convey the meaning so that your audience understands. I'll show you an example just now. And also remember, spell check is a great tool, but it won't detect words that have been incorrectly typed, but are still a proper English word. A good example of that is stain and strain. If you're talking about, I isolated strain A, you could easily make a typo and say, I isolated stain A. This is something that us as editors would most definitely pick up. Here's some examples. If you look at the yellow here, the yellow is showing some conciseness. The authors have written, nowadays, biobank data has become an important data source. To make that much easier to understand and direct, I've changed it to biobank data is an important source for GUS. And again here, they've said, because of its ability to collect, there's no need to write all of those words. You can just say, it collects. Another one here, due to the fact that, instead of using 5 words, you can just use the word because. And another one here, which may give rise to. Instead of that, you could just say, who may have. So its conciseness is very, very important. But once again, that's the job of an editor, and we will do this for you. Here in gray, I've shown you the example of some terminology or colloquialisms that English-speaking people will know, but perhaps you wouldn't be familiar with. The authors of this paper have said the participants are typically at the middle age. The way we would say it in English is the participants are typically middle-aged. Again, I've changed about to approximately to be more formal. And here is another example where they've started a sentence with and the GUSs changed it. I've changed it to additionally. Here's the example of something that's informal. They've said we don't need to limit the scope. I've changed that to we do not need to limit the scope. And then finally here's an example of a typo, which is still a proper word. So the whole way throughout this paper, they've talked about parental genotypes. However, there's been a typo here where they've talked about a prenatal instead of parental. Prenatal, as we know, is a proper word in English, but it's definitely the wrong word in this case. And that's definitely something that an editor would pick up and change for you. And then lastly, just one more example of conciseness. They have written the genotype of the parents. That's 4 words. An easier way to write it is parental genotype. Because something like this is the topic of the paper, it's a good idea to change it the whole way throughout. You're losing 2 words every time you change genotype of the parents to parental genotype. So I would search for of the parents and make that change throughout. Okay.
Thank you, Jenny. Let's take another short break for the second poll of this webinar. So we request all our participants to submit their answers. And I would also encourage all our participants to use the Q&A or chat options in the control panel below to send us any questions that you may have. Towards the end of this webinar, we will address as many of these queries as possible. So yes, our question for the question number 2 is, which of the following steps would help increase the chance of publication? You can select more than one option in this case as well. So option 1 is writing in simple but clear language, writing to the point, using a lot of technical jargon, using non-conventional terminology, and ensuring that the intended meaning is clear to the reader and not just the author. Please send in your answers. The more the merrier. All right. So Jenny, can we just go through the answers for this particular question and sort of like discuss what we feel the steps would be, which will help us increase the chance of publication? So let's say the
Absolutely.
first one, writing in simple but clear language.
I think that's one of the most important ones, and I see most of the attendees got that one right or voted for it. Writing in simple but clear language is definitely what you need to do. So it's spot on, totally right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Option 2,
Option
writing to the
2,
point.
yes, exactly. You do need to write to the point. You don't want to be using too many words. It's yeah, you get to the point. Don't skirt around it.
Right. What are your thoughts about technical jargon?
Technical jargon is not a good thing to use. It's good to use terminology that is familiar with people in the field, but don't go too technical that you're isolating all your readers and they have no idea what you're saying.
I wholeheartedly agree with this point. Actually, I have noticed many manuscripts through my 10 years of editing where I think that the author, although they have written in very technical language, the intention of the publication is to reach a wider audience. So, right, sometimes people want to reach researchers from other subject areas. And if somebody's writing in language that's very technical and very full of jargon, it becomes difficult for people from other research areas to understand what the author of the paper is trying to say, which then kind of decreases the impact or the number of citations that the paper actually has. So I think this is an important point. If you write it simple to the point and using minimal jargon, this will ensure that everybody understands what the author is trying to communicate, and this should help increase the reachability of the paper.
Yes,
Okay. What about conventional terminology? What are your thoughts on that, Jenny?
I think that sort of ties in with using technical jargon as well. But obviously using non-conventional terminology, it's just going to isolate your readers and make them think, but I thought you were actually talking about something else. So it is important to use conventional terminology. If you're not too sure, say there's a disease that's known as two different things, then why not, you can go and use something like Google Scholar and Google it. Google how often they would use the disease by one name and by another. Have a look at things like that if you're not too sure. Or when you send it to us, put a comment and say, please, can you have a look at this? And we can go from there.
Awesome. Thank you. And the last point is ensuring that the intended meaning is clear to the reader and not just the author. If you could just speak a few words on that.
Yes. I think as an author, you get very involved in your topic. And I mean, you are the expert on what you have written there. So you have to bear in mind to take a bit of a step back and make sure that the meaning is clear to the reader, because they don't have all that expertise. So you don't want to say it too simply, but just take a step back so that you know that if they've got a general background, say your paper's on antibodies or something, as long as they've got a general background in immunology, they'll understand what's going on.
Right, I agree. Also, a lot of times I have seen instances where so the author has a certain level of understanding about what they are writing about. And sometimes the construction of sentences does not really translate what actually is in the author's head. And the final result of this is that the reader does not understand what the author is trying to say, right? Sometimes we use pronouns like it and they, and there are several such things that could be referred here, but the author knows what they are referring to. Unfortunately, the reader might not understand that. So I think that's again how, like, when I edit, I try and ensure that all all our pronouns are clear. So if something is being referred to as it, then to the reader, it should be clear. It should not be one of the things that could be understood, because then again, it becomes on the perception of the reader. It should be very clear what the authors are referring to so that there is proper translation of information from one researcher to another, and hopefully it will benefit everybody.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think this has been a fair enough break. I think, Jenny, you can continue with the next topic. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Faisal. Okay, I'm just going to go on to some more tips and examples. Clarity, which I've already spoken a little bit on. You need to, and as Faisal even mentioned now, remove any ambiguity. You need to be precise and also refer back to the original source if necessary. I'll show you just now an example of that in this paper. Another thing to touch on is eponyms. It sounds like a really fancy word. All it means is that it's a product or an object or a discovery that's named after the person who discovered it or developed it. So traditionally, eponyms are named after the describer or the discoverer, and it would take the possessive form with an apostrophe S, like Alzheimer's disease. But now, according to the AMA, the move is toward the use of the non-possessive form. So you would then say Pearson correlation, Tourette syndrome, Crohn's disease. It's still something I'm even getting used to because it just sounds wrong. We've been brought up saying it with an apostrophe and being possessive, but it is something now. It sort of just polishes your paper at the end if you can put things like that in. So let me show you some examples. Okay, I was referring in the other slide to going back to the original source with ambiguity. Here in this paper, they have talked about that there's only 20% of UK biobank participants older than the age of 65 at recruitment. And then they've said, and only a few hundred late onset Alzheimer's disease cases. Now, that is ambiguity for you. a few hundred. If I read that, I might think 200. If you read it, you might think 400. So if it's possible, go back to the original paper and have a look. See how many do they mean, and see if you can get the population size as well. So that you could, instead of saying a few hundred, you could say 200 out of a population of 1,000. And then you could even, just to make it easier for the reader, list the percentage. And that would just add clarity and make your paper less confusing. Here we go with the eponym, where I've changed all cases in this paper from Alzheimer's to Alzheimer. I did that with a find and replace. It's quite a simple thing to do, but it's extremely important that it is consistent the whole way throughout the manuscript. Here's an example in blue of a colloquialism. It does happen quite a bit, where you're talking about on the one hand and then on the other hand. So two alternative situations. And here the author has written on the other hands. So that's incorrect, and I will change it to on the other hand. A couple of more tips and examples. One thing that is quite a common problem that happens with people who do not have English as their first language is the correct use of transitions. It's quite hard to do if you don't speak English every day. For me, it's something I don't think about, but when I read manuscripts, you can see that it's an area where people do battle. So a transition connects one idea to the next. It links sentences together, and it links paragraphs together. And they help your paper to move along smoothly and go from one topic to the next. And also there's usually a comma after the transition word, like however, therefore. They will have a comma after them. There's a lot of transitions, just a few. Furthermore, additionally, moreover. If you're doing a sequence of events, you might want to say secondly, thirdly, fourthly, or initially, finally, subsequently. So transitions are very important to help your flow of ideas and for everyone to see the steps that were taken in the correct author. I'm going to show you an example here. So here is an example of where the authors have talked about culturing some cells and then extracting the DNA and then doing PCR on the extracted DNA. I'm just going to read it out to you. The cells were grown in nutrient broth. They were collected to determine the concentration using spectrometry. Secondly, we extracted the nuclear DNA using a Chi-Am DNA kit. We determined the DNA concentration. And we performed PCR using this primer and this primer. The conditions were denaturation at 98 degrees centigrade for 1 minute, 30 cycles of 98 degrees centigrade for 60 seconds, 60 degrees centigrade for 15 seconds, 68 degrees centigrade for 30 seconds, final elongation at 72 degrees for 60 seconds. The PCR products underwent electrophoresis to determine their purity. Then they were sequenced in both directions. It's quite a mouthful when you look at it like that, because there's no transitions. So to make it easier for the reader to understand how the process went, I've added those in and I've highlighted them in green. So to start off with, it's a good idea at the beginning of a process to say first or firstly. So I've added that. First, the cells were cultured in nutrient broth, comma, then they were harvested following overnight incubation at 37 degrees centigrade. If you look at the example here, they've said that the cells were collected and then they extracted the nuclear DNA, but they've left out a whole step. How long were the cells incubated for before they were harvested? So it's a very good idea. Once you've written your process down, to sort of go through the steps in your head and think, how would I do it? And also remember that when you put down a process like this, other people will try to replicate your research, and you want them to be able to do that. But if you leave out a crucial step like that, maybe they'll incubate for the wrong time or at the wrong temperature. It won't work. And that just doesn't make your research look very credible if they can't reproduce it. Okay, so then going on from that, I've said next, we determine the concentration using spectrometry. Thereafter, we extracted the nuclear DNA using a QIAMP DNA kit. Just here, I've also added in the supplier details, which is usually a requirement of the journal. And then I've said after determining the DNA concentration, we performed PCR using these primers. And then the conditions were, for this section, if you're familiar with PCR, you'll know that there's always an initial denaturation step, and then there's a number of cycles, which has got 3 sub-steps in it. So the way it was written with just commas made it seem like there wasn't the cycles, the 30 cycles didn't look correct. So here, all I've done is I've used semicolons between the big processes. So we've said denaturation at 98 degrees for 1 minute, semicolon. So that's separate. That's a process by itself. Then we've gone into 30 seconds of 30 cycles of 98 degrees centigrade for 10 seconds, comma, because this is still talking about the 30 cycles. Then I've said 60 degrees centigrade for 15 seconds, comma, and 68 degrees centigrade for 30 seconds, and a semicolon. So that's described all the processes that are happening in those 30 cycles. And then we've moved on to the final step of PCR, which is and final elongation at 72 degrees centigrade for 60 seconds. Then another transition here. Instead of saying the PCR products underwent electrophoresis, I've changed it to afterward, because you've just performed PCR, so you can say afterward. And the last thing that happened here was finally they were sequenced in both directions. Also on this, a couple of other things that are important to note in the yellow, the use of correct terminology. The authors here said the cells were grown in nutrient broth and then they were collected. If you're talking about cell culture, in English, the appropriate word would be that the cells were cultured in nutrient broth and then they would be harvested. Another thing here, a bit of terminology, is when you perform PCR, you'd be doing it using a primer pair. So instead of primers, just for a bit more clarity, I would change that to primer pair. And then also when you're referring to primers, it's also good to put which end is the 3' and the 5'. If someone is going to be using your work and synthesizing those primers, you don't want them to synthesize it backwards, because then it won't work. So it's very important to put that in, or at least say forward primer and reverse primer. Okay, over to you, Faisal.
All right. Thank you so much again, Jenny. Now I think it's time for question number 3 for this webinar. Just 1 second. Okay, so the next question is, 1 second, I seem to be having some technical issues. Right, okay. We have to select the statements that are true. Again, it's multiple choice, so please feel free to select multiple answers. The first option is, according to AMA, the correct way to write the name of this disease is Parkinson's disease. The next option is, The use of appropriate transitions helps link sentences and paragraphs together. The third point is write as much information as possible in your manuscript. And the last option is transitions help the reader smoothly follow one idea after another. We'll just wait for another minute, giving everybody a chance to answer this. Okay, people have answered. Right. So, Jenny, what are your thoughts about this? I think you just covered this. So, you just told us that AMA has now started leaning towards avoiding the use of possessive form when referring to such diseases. Eponyms,
Yes.
is that the right pronunciation? Eponyms? Is that how we do it?
Yes, eponyms, yeah.
Right. So, okay. So I think this point is clear that we should not use the possessive form for Parkinson's disease. It should, now the preference is to call it Parkinson disease, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. The second point is the use of appropriate transitions helps link sentences and paragraphs together. I think most of us have answered this correctly. And
Yes.
I feel it's quite straightforward. The third point, I think, is worthy of discussion. Write as much information as possible in your manuscript. Jenny, what do you think about this point?
It's very hard when you're so passionate about writing a paper on a subject you're interested in. You want to put as much information in as possible. And I understand that. But you've got to remember that, firstly, some journals have stringent word counts. And secondly, you don't want to lose your key message by writing too much information. If you've got a lot of information, an idea would be to maybe divide it up into a few papers on different topics. Also, there's also that feeling that you must provide all the background information so your readers understand. But like I've mentioned, people who are reading your paper will already have a scientific background to a certain extent. So yeah, you can't write everything. It's impossible. Just try and stick to a few key points, not to confuse your audience. And as I said, I would rather write a second paper dealing with a slightly different view of the topic.
All right, thank you. Our last option was transitions help the reader smoothly follow one idea after another. Again, this is one of the most commonly selected answers. And Jenny, I think, has covered this quite well with the various examples and how we should use them. I think the detailed explanation would help. So that covers the third question in this webinar. Jenny, would you like to continue, please?
Thank you. Now I'm going to quickly just go over specific requirements for an academic paper. So as I mentioned before, you're not writing a magazine article or a letter, and it's not conversational. So there are specific things that will just polish your paper and help it to have a better chance of being accepted by the journal that you're submitting to. One of the things that I find happens quite a lot is the use of terminology. Especially if English is not your first language, you might not be familiar with some of the terms. But say, for example, you're doing a case study and you're presenting characteristics of a patient, you're describing them to the readers. You might be saying that there's something wrong with their liver. Instead of using liver, a scientific, better way to say it would be hepatic, to say hepatic disease instead of liver disease. Another example is something like blood infection. Instead of blood infection, an easier way to say it is sepsis. Other ones that I see quite often is the patient had a fever. Instead of that, you can say there was pyrexia, or the patient was pyrexic. I've covered these two about culture and harvesting. And also I've spoken about approximately. So just be aware that there are sometimes better ways to say it. But I think as people write, then we could, as you write and editors give you these type of changes, it will just help you as an author to improve so that every time you write, you'll pick up more terminology like this. General formatting requirements. Just little things to remember. Remember, Enago can format your paper for you. So you don't have to do this. But if you choose to do it yourself, these are things that you should bear in mind to do. The journal of submission will probably have a word or character count limit on the title or the running title or the abstract or the overall word count. So bear this in mind. Even if you've got a sort of an idea of which journal you want to submit to, it's a very good idea to know that before you start. Because I can just think of nothing worse than you write a 6,000 word paper and they say original articles must be 3,000 words. You don't want to be stuck in that situation. A lot of the journals will specify how many tables and figures that they would like. Usually that's due to space requirements. But what's a great thing that you can do there is you can make supplemental tables and supplemental figures. Those are usually online content. But if you really feel it's important, then do it like that. And then you can just refer to it in the text. For more info, see supplemental table 1. The other thing that some of the journals do is they specify the number of references. So unless you're doing like a literature review, where there's maybe 100 references. In something like an original article, if you list 100 references, that's going to be way too many. So have a look at what the journals said before you even write, and then stick to the key references. If you don't need to use 3 references that emphasize the same point, you could use 1. And also on references, make sure that you try and use the ones that are the most recent, the most up-to-date references. Don't use an old reference, especially when you're submitting to a journal. The reviewers will be up to date with all these things, and that's something that they could point out as a correction for you to do. Other little things: don't forget to list your authors and their affiliations on the title page. Indicate the corresponding author. Provide details of ethical approval. Very important. That you put the committee that approved it. And if you've got an ethical approval number, please put that in. Provide details of informed consent. Also very important. Remember with children, yes, they can't provide informed consent, but that's no reason not to ignore it. You must then get the parents or the guardians to provide that informed consent. If you're doing an experiment on animals, then it's a very good idea to please provide the standards of animal care that you used and that you followed to look after the animals. Disclose any conflicts of interest. Very important to put that in. Some journals would like author contribution statements. It's becoming, I think, a requirement in more journals than not. So that's important. And a data availability statement. I've touched on this already, that references must not be outdated or inappropriate. Also remember, very important, and I see it a lot, if there's a reference in the text, make sure that it's in the reference list. Again, also the other way around, sometimes there's a reference in the reference list when you were writing your draft version of the paper, then you decided to take out that information, but you didn't change the reference list. So please make sure that those two correlate. It's also something we would check. Do a quick check if you included the reference list in your submission to us. That's quite an easy thing for us to check. Here's something else that's important. In the abstract, you must never put references. It's inappropriate. So the paper that I've been going through with you, they did put references, so I've taken it out. Here, if you're going to be using the author date system, you must remember to put the author and the date in brackets. They hadn't done that. So I've just changed that. There's the author, comma, and the year. And then just quickly on this one here, it's a paper by one author. It's very uncommon to get papers by one author. So if I, as an editor, saw that and you had provided the reference list, I would go and check, is it really one author? If the reference list wasn't provided, I would probably put a comment saying, please just check that this is definitely a single author paper. And then just the last thing on tables and figures. Always remember that tables and figures must be able to be understood apart from the text. Because that's something actually that people will first look at, because it's going to be a summary of your findings. So when you're doing figures and tables, they must always have a title, and they must be cited in sequential order. Very important, define all your abbreviations that are in the table footnotes. It's hard to remember and to then go back and wade through all that, the text, to find where was that abbreviation, what does it mean? Please put that in. The other thing that's important is any abbreviations in figures must also be explained in the figure legend. I'll show that to you now. Label both axes in a graph. That's often not done, and then that just adds to confusion. It's just another thing for the reviewer to pick up on and make a comment. If you use different colors in figures, please explain that. In tables with numbers, it's always a good idea to round them off to the same decimal points. It just looks tidy and neat, and remember your rounding off must be correct. Often I see rounding off errors. It's not really, I can't possibly check a whole table with rounding off, but if I do a random check, and I find that a couple of your that the rounding off is not correct, I'll make a comment for you to please check something like that, because down the line that could have an effect on the statistical analysis that you do. And then important, the numbers in the table must correspond with the text. Like I said earlier, if you said 50% in the text, you need to make sure there was 50% in the table. And here's an example of a figure. As you can see, we've labeled the figure. Oops, there we go. Here's the figure title, very important to put in. They've explained here on the left, the two circles represent the cell from the father and the mother respectively, with the chromosomes in the father colored in blue and the ones in the mother in red. So they've explained what the colors mean. They've labeled the axes. They've also explained what the abbreviations mean: type 2 diabetes, T2D, and cardiovascular disease, CAD. So they've included all the elements that are needed in a figure. And that's the end of that section.
Thank you so much again, Jenny, for your insights. I think now is a good time to let the attendees know about the key takeaways from this entire session, please.
Okay. Just a few key takeaways for you to remember for when you write your next paper. Editing is crucial to publication success, particularly for ESL authors. So send it to us for an edit. Even if it's just a copy edit, we can add value, undoubtedly. The other thing is that remember that editors were going to check for English and subject matter errors. So you're getting a 2-in-1. You might think, well, I might as well send it to just a normal English editor that's not scientific, with scientific background. That's really not such a good idea. You won't be getting the value out of it that we can provide by having a subject matter editor do it for you. And remember that each time you submit a paper for edit, we are going to make comments, and those comments will help you to improve on your next submission to us.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. I think you can stop sharing your screen. That's the end of the document. Sorry. So now coming to the second leg of the session, which is our live Q&A section. Uh, I would encourage other attendees that have not yet sent us their queries to reach out to us using the Q&A section or the chat section, and we'll be glad to assist as many people as possible uh, with our questions. So we have already received a few questions. I think, Jenny, would you be open to discussing them while we wait for some other questions to come in?
Sure.
Sure. So actually, a couple of our attendees have asked a question on the same line. So one of them goes like, is it good style to use personal pronouns such as we or our? Uh, the attendee says that they try to avoid such kind of usage, but they noted that you changed in the abstract, edited abstract you showed, you changed text to we. So
I
another
changed.
attendee, yeah, so you
Okay.
made a change where you introduced we, right? So
Okay.
basically, in other words, the attendee is asking, should the paper be written in first person language or third person language?
Okay.
Can you please give us your thoughts on that, please?
Sure. It really depends on the section of the paper that you're talking about. So when you're starting with the abstract, it's a very good idea to start with we. We did this, because you're saying what you did at that time. However, when you're moving on to the methods and describing things, it's easier to use the passive voice. So instead of saying we extracted the DNA, you would be saying the DNA was extracted. The reason why it's better to use that than saying we did this, we did this, we did this, is because then overall, when you put the sentence together, it's actually going to be shorter. And of course, when you're writing a paper, you're not talking about what you did, you're talking about your research, about your paper. So you don't want to take the focus off that. You want to not use too many personal pronouns so that the focus is on the process and what actually happened.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So we have another question. Just 1 second. I'll read it out. One of our attendees has asked if it would be possible for us to elaborate on figure legends. So I think they want an overview in general,
Sure.
as in what they are, how could one write good figure legends, etc.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just find that figure that I had over here and share that with you. I don't know if I can share it until the other screen is off. Oh, there. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the figure?
Yes, it's visible.
All right. So they want more detail on how to do a figure legend, basically.
Yeah, maybe we could start off with what a figure legend is, as in like the
Yes.
purpose behind it, something like that, maybe.
Sure. So a figure legend is something that's going to explain exactly what is in your picture, your diagram, or your graph. It's going to go into quite a bit of detail because it's so much easier to convey information in a figure than to write it. Much, much easier, and much easier for the audience to understand as well. So you would have your figure, it would have a number, and then you're just going to write a 1-sentence summary of what is this figure about. That will be the title. Then once you've done that, perhaps you've got 4 graphs here instead of 1. Then you would be going, A, and then saying graph showing the prevalence of diabetes in infants. And then after that, you would explain about that graph. So you would say the graph shows that children who eat sweets are significantly more at risk of having diabetes. And then in your graph, perhaps you would have a p-value or something that's significant. There's no need to put that in the legend because the information is in the text, in your figure. So it's basically a figure legend is a guide to interpreting the figure, but you're not going to say all that information again. You're not going to repeat it. You're just going to pick out the little key points on it and then leave it so that the author can, so that the reader can have a look at it and see what's going on. And then importantly, define every single abbreviation, especially in figures. You find that sometimes something is abbreviated, but it's never been abbreviated in the manuscript. Like here, they've abbreviated CAD, cardiovascular disease. That's not a very common abbreviation, and it's quite easy to write out cardiovascular disease in a paper. So something like that, it's very important that you have defined all your abbreviations so that the people, the readers can understand it. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Faisal?
No, I think you've covered all points very well. I completely agree that whatever information possible should be shown in the figure itself, and there should be minimal descriptions about it, because I think visual representation, especially to the target audience, considering that people who will be reading this paper do come from some level of science background, I think they will be able to understand a lot of information just by looking at the visual that an author can create. So I think that's one very important point that I feel that you've covered in quite good detail. The other points, I completely agree with what you've said. Right. Thank you. Okay, so our next question comes from another attendee of ours. They were hoping that we could share some good English to English dictionaries or some online resources that authors can use while preparing their manuscript. Anything that comes.
Yeah, a good English dictionary that I use is the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, if you use it, Faisal.
I do actually, especially for American English documents, I do refer to it quite a lot. So I have seen that most the way to represent information in American English is best shown in Merriam-Webster. I have tried referring to other sources as well, but I feel that this particular dictionary is, you can call it a holy grail, or you can call it, you know, whatever way you want to refer to it. But for American English documents, I also refer to this very dictionary. And I think the kind of examples they offer are very explanatory. They do not go for very complicated examples, so that the reader can understand what the word actually means and then apply it in the context that they want to. Plus, I think I agree that Merriam-Webster is a good dictionary because they give you all possible definitions in different forms. So if you're talking about the word X, it will refer to the word X in noun form, in adjective form, in adverb form. So all possible ways it can be used, and they provide examples for each of them. So I think it's, I would say probably the most used dictionary is Merriam-Webster for me.
Also for me, which makes it even better, is that it's free. You don't have to subscribe to it. So yeah, it's a fantastic dictionary. The other one that I've tried to use but didn't have much luck with is Dorland's Medical Dictionary, which is a fantastic dictionary. I've got a hard copy of it. That is amazing. But when I subscribed to it, it didn't seem to offer the same, it looked different. It just didn't seem right. The same content that you would get from the hard copy, which is a bit strange because I did subscribe to it. But I would, if you're thinking of it, perhaps find something else. That's just my opinion.
Right. So then would you recommend people to buy the hard copy instead? Because again, through your personal experience.
Yeah, I would, but it's very expensive.
Okay.
You could probably do would take a bit longer, but to use Google and to search for definitions that way for medical terminology might be a bit better, or to use Google Scholar and try and search for the word like that and see if someone's defined it. I think
Yeah.
that's a bit more work, but at least then it doesn't cost the money.
Yeah, I agree. I also do use Google Scholar a lot, and I think I have just one tip for our attendees. When you do use Google Scholar, if you want the search engine to look for a particular term exactly as you have typed it, then please add that information in double quotes, right? So if you're looking for the words X, Y, Z, which can be anything, please add opening quote X, Y, Z and closing quote. If you do include it in this manner, what the search engine does is that it looks for that text in published papers directly in that form. So it will look exactly for XYZ. It will not look for YXZ or ZXY. So if you are trying to understand how a particular phrase is used commonly and you want to see what published papers have used, then I think using double quotes is the most effective way to see, to help make a decision. That's right.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So another query from one of our attendees is, how do editors estimate the impact of a research? Are there any ways to make an editor understand the impact of a research clearly and easily?
That's quite a tough one. Because me as an editor, I've got a very broad background of, yes, I'm still an expert in the field, but it's a broad background. So for me personally to assess the impact, it's quite hard. I don't know, Faisal, how you feel about that.
Yeah, so I think like when we look at the impact, right, as in, because like you mentioned, we are editors and we get to work on a lot of manuscripts, right? We do this day in and day out. So I think a lot of the assessment of impact happens subconsciously, to be very honest, because we understand like how you very clearly broke down your analysis process when you look at a manuscript. So when I do come across some like phrases or some information present in the document, I then look at it in its entirety, right, to see if the authors are saying that the purpose of my paper is X. Does the information that's been presented in the paper, does it match that as an objective? And if that objective will be important for a journal, then if text is written in a particular way, then I know that the impact of the research is high. And therefore, I try and match the objective statement and the edits around that. So if like if the authors intend to get into a deep dive on some topic, then the information should be presented in that manner. It cannot be very surface level information. So, I mean, that's how I do this. And then when it comes to impact, then uh, I go by what reviewer comments I have received on earlier assignments that match. So luckily, because we are editors, like professionally, we get to work on a lot of manuscripts from various kinds of journals. And I think the reviewers from each journal bring their expertise. And over time, I've picked up small bits and pieces from various journal editors and sometimes editors in chief, and that's how I land up assessing the impact of a research. All right. So one of our attendees had asked us if we edit papers in the area of education. Yes, as a company, yes, we do edit papers in this subject area, but this will be edited by freelance editors and other editors who are experts in that field. So as Jenny mentioned, she's associated with life sciences, and I have a background in biomedical engineering. So I too share a similar background as Jenny. So if you do submit a paper to us from the field of education, it will be edited by somebody who belongs to that field. So yes, we do edit such papers. Okay, I think we have one more question. Just 1 second. Okay. one of our other attendees has asked, how do you think we should cite supplemental data in the discussion section? I think if the author of this question means that if they want to refer to supplemental data from the same manuscript, then how could they go about mentioning this in the discussion section? Do you have any tips on that? Maybe some sentences as examples?
That's quite a hard one. If you were going to cite supplemental data in the discussion, it would have to be very brief and the sort of to the point of the point you're trying to make. Because remember, not everyone is going to see that supplemental data or want to see the supplemental data, because it might be a bit of a, click on another link and they won't want to necessarily do it. So if you want to refer to it, you would say something like, as presented in supplemental table 1, we found that blah, blah, blah. So that is how I'd do it. It's a bit tricky. If it's going to be, if you find that you really need to cite that, then maybe you haven't put, maybe that table or figure shouldn't be supplemental. Maybe it needs to be in the main text.
Yeah, I think so too. Like if it's important information, if it's so important that you have to mention it in the discussion, then probably it should be part of the main manuscript. Unless there is some limitation in terms of number of figures that are allowed or the length of a paper in terms of pages. I think unless that is the reality at the time, it is advisable to include important figures and tables as part of the actual document and not as supplementary information. Okay, another possible meaning that this question could have is it good practice to cite supplemental data in a discussion section? Does that change your answer anyway?
I don't find in the majority of papers that I have edited that supplemental data is cited in the discussion section because it's supplemental. So no, I don't think that it's like that.
Right. So then it's not advisable, but in case there is, a circumstance where the formatting requirements do not allow, let's say, adding that figure or table as part of the main document, only in such conditions is it advisable to add it in supplementary data and then refer to it, right? Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Jenny, I think just towards the end, do you have any advice, any final advice that you would like to give to ESL writers and attendees that have been part of this session?
I think my advice is don't give up and carry on writing. We are here to help you, and it's a journey together that we can take. So don't feel disheartened if there's a lot of striking out and comments all over your paper. It's all stuff, it's all a learning process, and we're all going through this together. So I think it's very impressive to write in another language. I certainly couldn't do it.
Right, I agree. And I think as you mentioned earlier, it's just important to know that the editor and the author's goal is the same, to get the paper published, right? Obviously, we cannot be as happy as the author when a paper gets published, but from inside there is this happiness that comes when a paper that we have worked on gets published. So absolutely. I think our goal is the same, and I would encourage people to try out such kind of services. So, right. Okay. Right. So just 1 second. Yeah, sorry. So here are some special discounts on Enago editing services for all the participants. To avail the offer, you can use the discount codes given here when you upload your manuscript. We offer 3 levels of editing. For more details, you can visit our website, and hopefully you will find something that suits you. So again, thank you so much, Jenny, for your valuable time and suggestions and the detailed demonstration. We are all enlightened and we definitely have useful takeaways from this session. We
Thank you.
request all the participants, you're welcome. We request all the participants to please take the feedback survey by scanning the QR code on your screen and let us know if the discussion was helpful and what you would expect in future sessions. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for joining the webinar. See you all next time. Thank you, everybody.